Good, mo- Good morning, guys, and welcome to Unique Not Different with me, Shanga. And today I have Dr. Sarah Suhan, who is the PRO of the Autistic Society of Trinidad and Tobago. So today she is going to actually talk about in terms of disaster, emergency, and risk mitigation in terms of how, what they are doing and how to deal with children and persons in general who has autism because given different scenarios persons who is autistic tend to deal with things differently. So good morning, Dr. Suhan, and thanks for joining Unique Not Different. How are
Hi,
you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Awesome. So in terms of the Autistic Society of Trinidad and Tobago as a group, what collaboration is happening in terms of through, let's say, ODPM, the EMA, etc., in terms of getting persons sensitized on how to deal with children and young adults, adults as well, who is autistic.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that the ODPM has been consulting with NGOs that represent persons with disabilities. And this is not a recent consultation, this has been ongoing. I was actually checking back at some of the meetings that we've had, and as recent as this year, they have actually invited us to continue working with them on sensitization in terms of preparing for disaster. So there has been ongoing consultation on this issue. And what they have actually done, which is really helpful, is that they have actually helped to prepare an emergency planning guide for the special need population centers. So that would include places like Autism Place. But there's also a lot of information for those who may not be aware that's available on their website that shows families how they can prepare for disasters. So some of the things that they have highlighted for us in terms of consultation, of course, is around planning. Um, Being able to be prepared for disaster rather than just focusing on the response. In consultation with them, we've learned a lot about how we can prepare for disaster. And for families with special need populations, and this includes people with mobility challenges or the elderly, a lot of preparation is around practicing and exercising evacuation plans, planning evacuation plans, and designing these for your family needs. And so this is something that we have also began implementing within our center. So kind of creating muster points, having an evacuation plan, and also helping to disseminate information around disaster preparedness.
So in terms of as a group, right, and having the sensitization and I guess planning in terms of disaster and emergency preparedness, how are you all well, what are you all doing in terms of actually reaching persons who would be impacted in the event that a disaster emergency happens?
Yes, so because our organization, and this is probably very specific to us because we do have a physical center, one of the things that we had discussed, and even in response to, for example, the pandemic, is that our center became a sort of a place where people can connect, make connections, access resources. So, for example, during the pandemic, our center was used quite a lot to distribute food for persons with autism and their families who were in need of that. And so our center has sort of become a hub and can become a hub for persons with autism in the event of a disaster. Um, And so that's one area that we have focused on in terms of being able to sort of act as that go between in terms of communication. And this is sort of in line with the ODPM's idea of creating a support network for people in the event of a disaster. One of the things that we recognize is that not every government agency has, that list of persons, easily accessible. And so disability organizations are essentially that connection between the community and organizations like the ODPM, where we can communicate very easily, and we do communicate very easily with people within our organization, and so we can sort of act as that go-between.
And given your experience, right? And I guess, the sensitization and stuff as I mentioned that took place and is taking place in terms of how, in terms of actual responsiveness from, persons who are autistic, in the event of an emergency or disaster, how should persons who respond actually respond, when dealing with someone who is autistic?
Yes, so that was something that has also been addressed and is ongoing in terms of preparing persons, as you said, who are first responders, to respond in the event of having to interact with someone during a disaster who's autistic. Some of the discussions that we have had are around helping the person to remain calm, because people with autism can tend to experience a lot of anxiety. And of course, in a disaster, there's a lot of unexpected events happening. And this is kind of where planning becomes really important, not just as an organization, but within the family unit. Part of planning includes sort of planning around communication. So being able to communicate well with your child in the event of a disaster so that they understand what is taking place around them. Also, assembling and having a disaster supply kit ready is another great form of planning. And this is where things like medication, equipment, and personal supplies are set aside in the event of a disaster. Because we also recognize that organizations like the ODPM may not have those specific things available in the event of a disaster. And so what they have suggested is for families to really create disaster supply kits that would have everything that a person with autism might need. And for our families, it might include things like visual aids, it might include any medication, it might include equipment for mobility, and so those are some of the things that they had recommended that we encourage families to have. And of course, as a family unit, sort of designing an evacuation plan, but also conducting emergency drills. So again, because people with autism really struggle with unexpected change, it helps a lot for there to be practice in advance. So being able to practice what an emergency drill looks like, being able to practice what evacuation could look like, and also preparing families or making them aware of who they might interact with in the event of an emergency. And as you said, we've also kind of sort of given some information for first responders as well in terms of their awareness of autism and what it could look like, and sort of supporting someone to remain calm.
How can persons reach out to the Autistic Society for support?
So they can connect with us via telephone at 646-5506. We're also quite active on Facebook, and that's one way that we have a lot of people contact us. So you can look up Autistic Society of Trinidad and Tobago, and of course via email at autismtt@gmail.com.
And just in general, what are some advice would you give, given your experience working? I'm actually very curious, in terms of your personal story and how you got into it. But I guess we could have another conversation about that. But in terms of advice, for parents and guardians who deal with children with autism, what advice would you give?
Well, I think especially in terms of preparing for disaster, I think the preparation part is key, and that's something that we've been advised very strongly by the ODPM is to create plans and to practice. So that when a disaster occurs, whether it be flooding in our area, that's a huge one, to have a plan so that people are understanding what's happening around them. People with autism would fully understand what's happening around them. They would feel prepared. They would feel less anxious and more calm in the event of a disaster. And planning can also help sort of mitigate any unnecessary risks that can occur in terms of injury and preventing injury.
Dr. Sarah Suhan, thank you so much for coming. And this was, very insightful conversation as it deals with persons with disability and also, in particular, persons who are autistic. So thank you so much. And I definitely want to have you back for you to share your story and how you got into, this realm of, expertise. So thank you again. Guys, with that being said, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in to this week's segment of Unique and Different. As I always say, be good, do good. Bye, guys. Bye, Dr. Zita.